As well as the great abbeys, there is one other piece of medieval construction that inspires us like no other, the castle. The history of our castles can be traced back to what is probably the best known date in English history, 1066. On the 14th of October, William, Duke of Normandy, who considered himself rightful heir to the recently deceased Edward the Confessor, crossed the Channel with heavy cavalry and archers, defeating his rival claimant, King Harold II, near Hastings in Suffolk. To secure a hold on England, William began the construction of castles in major towns to demonstrate his authority and overawe the indigenous population. Here we stay. Resistance is futile. Accept Norman nobility, class and language. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the Peak District was a relatively quiet political backwater. Most of the castles were small and of a timber and earth construction. They were built to this hasty design as the most pressing matter of Normans was to consolidate their power. Decades on, many of the early castles were rebuilt in stone, but with the Peak District being so quiet and remote, most were not. Most of the Norman castles were not dramatic, huge affairs. Behind me is the remains of the 12th century Motte and Bailey Castle at Bakewell that was built during the anarchy, during the reign of King Stephen. Now, most of these earthworks that do survive are simply small mounds, which is the Motte, and a ditch, which is the Bailey. Excavations in the 60s found this was only partially occupied in Bakewell, but there are the remains of several of the Baileys still surviving outside. Because this quite small, they end up being very overgrown and aren't usually noticed monuments by people, so they're quite difficult to access, but you'd be surprised at how many of them there actually are, not just around the Peak District but around the rest of the country. But when the Normans came over, they had to keep control, and so these castles, not just giant ones but the small ones, sprung up everywhere. A much more prominent Motte and Bailey dominates the upper reaches of the River Dove. This is the remains of Pillsbury Castle. It was built on an important routeway along the Dove Valley and is located next to the original crossing point of the river. Pillsbury Castle was most likely built by Henry de Ferrers, who was granted lands in the area by King William in the 11th century. He also constructed nearby Tutbury and Duffield castles to the south of the Peak District, showing his wide-ranging influence. The massive motte, some 12 metres high, is surrounded by a sequence of baileys up to 45 metres across and would have had strong timber defences within. A steep-sided natural knoll was also utilised as part of the eastern defences. Although no buildings remain visible, archaeologically the site has suffered very little disturbance over the years, and so is archaeologically well preserved. Pillsbury Castle was likely to have been abandoned in the 13th century, as the nearby settlement of Hartington grew in importance, and the small village of Pillsbury to the south gradually became deserted. The only stone castle in Derbyshire was Peveril, standing watch on a high limestone crag above the village of Castleton. Not only an important trade route, the castle also guarded the valuable lead being mined in the area. Possibly due to its status, the castle appears to have been constructed of stone from the start. Peveril takes its name from William Peveril, a rewarded follower of William the Conqueror. A local legend even makes the bold claim that Peveril was William's illegitimate son. The exact year of founding is not clear, but it was recorded in the Domesday Book of 1086, not a foreshadowing of the end of the world, but a record of a great strategic survey of land carried out on the orders of William. Peveril's son inherited the castle, but backed Empress Matilda during the civil war with King Stephen, known as the Anarchy. In 1155, the castle was confiscated by Henry II and became the administrative centre for the Forest of the Peak. The woods are lovely, dark and deep. If I was to use the word forest, it would probably conjure up in your mind an image similar to this. Ancient trees strangled by ivy, dense undergrowth heading off into an impenetrable distance. But in fact, that is not what the word forest means. If you were to go down to the New Forest in southern England, you'd be disappointed if you expected to find a vast swathe of ancient wildwood. In fact, the majority is open heathland, for the word forest means an area given over to the royal chase. In 1079, William I turned 3% of England into his royal hunting forest. What we're standing in now would have been part of his Forest of the Peak, which covered a vast area of the Peak District from Glossop in the north to Leek in the south and heading over to Macclesfield Forest on the Cheshire Plain. If you were somebody who lived in the area, your life would have been displaced. Even though many were not made to leave, you could not put your animals out in the forest, nor could you change any of the land that was there for his wild beasts, such as the boar and the deer. There were harsh penalties too. If you were caught killing any of his venison, you could have your hands chopped off, be blinded, or in some cases even be put to death. Peveril Castle served to not only manage the royal forest, but also to imprison and prosecute those offenders against forest law. The laws were harsh, but didn't last long, as the importance of the royal forest diminished. By the 13th century, they had relaxed, and by the Tudor period, they had become anachronistic. When we are looking for physical evidence of the ancient forest, the links that we can find are few and far between. But here in All Saints Parish Church we have a tombstone for one of the foresters, itself medieval in date and engraved with a bow and arrows. The foresters would have helped to look after the game, controlling not only their numbers but also protecting them from poachers and dangerous animals. The bows and arrows pictured on the Bakewell forester's tomb would have been used for this purpose. One further grave survived over the hills at Chelmorton, this time carved with axes which would have been used for coppicing and clearing the forest. Another church provides us with a link to an ancient forest legend, Robin Hood. We have all heard tales of Robin of Locksley, who roamed the wild and lawless 13th century forests to rob from the rich and give to the poor. He has come to symbolise the eternal struggle of everyday people against those who have everything and refuse to share it. As with many legends, it is very hard to trace the origin of the Robin Hood mythos. The earliest chronicle reference to Robin Hood is by Andrew of Winton in around 1420 AD. These early records refer to him being of noble birth, who having returned from the Third Crusade finds himself dispossessed and outlawed. The popular view of the handsome man clad in green with a merry band who were always on hand to foil the plans of wicked King John was invented much later by the Romantics. On the southern edge of the limestone is the village of Doveridge, where in the churchyard of St Cuthbert there is a tangible link to the time of Robin Hood. The church bells ring and give away the fact that this magnificent yew, 1,400 years old and the youngest, lies in the churchyard of St Cuthbert in Doveridge. Its 22-foot girth and over 240-foot circumference of its branches were the ones under which it was said that Maid Marian and Robin Hood were married. Throughout the entirety of what's happened in the previous several hours of this documentary, this tree has been alive. It is amazing to stand inside something so ancient, so grand, and with such magical qualities. Indeed, you often find yew trees planted in churchyards. They have a long association with the dead, but also with regeneration. For if a branch falls off a yew tree, it most often than not will regrow. In fact, yew trees that have been cut down and built into medieval houses have even had new trees spring forth from the dead wood. Another very old aspect of the Robin Hood legend also has a link to the Peak District. None of the early references contain mention of the Merry Men, but do refer to Robin's highly capable and intelligent companion, Little John. The name is explained in a surviving 17th century ballad which refers to John as a strong man, 7 foot tall, who tried to prevent Robin from crossing a narrow bridge and won. John was so impressed with Robin's courage that he offered to join him. His real name was John Little, but Robin Hood reversed this as a whimsical play on words. Little John was also said to be the only merry man present at Robin's death. Robin's fate came when he was deceived and poisoned by the abbess of Kirklees Priory. Realising his end was nigh, Robin drew his bow for the final time and asked John to bury him where the last arrow fell. After laying Robin down in the earth, John is said to have returned back to his home of Hathersage, where he spent his remaining days. Before the end, he dug his own grave under the old yew tree in the graveyard, where it can still be seen today. The grave was reopened in 1782, and the skeleton of a man 7 foot tall was discovered. John had also directed before his death that his cap, longbow and arrows should be hung in the church, where they remained until disappearing in the early 19th century.
There's a grand old tavern where the beer's always good, and she goes by the name of the old Robin Hood. And the timbers are old and stand where Robin stood, on the treasure in the soil of merry England. The old grey flagstones that lie upon the floor have worn with the passage of the barefoot and the sore, and the heroes and the villains who pass beneath the door lie buried in graves long forgotten. So come and raise your glasses, there's a song to be sung, stories to tell and games to be won. Swallow your spirit and swallow your pride, drink to many evenings such as this. There are great wooden beams between the roof and the ground, and though blackened by fire smoke, there still can be found the carvings of lovers who make no further sound, and whose stories have never been told. Men have argued for centuries in seats around the fire over politics, religion, both the ploughboy and the squire. And the old leaded windows, they look down with a sigh, 'cause they've seen it all so many times before. So come and raise your glasses, there's a song to be sung.
On the next episode, we shall go back beyond the Norman conquest to find enlightening secrets of the Dark Ages, see the dominating impact of the Romans, and begin a quest to those times before records began. These are the stories in stone.